So now that we've learned about what motivated cognition is and cognitive biases are, let's talk about how to combat them. This isn't an all-inclusive list, and you can find lots of easy-to-read pop culture style articles about this online if you want to read more of that style. You can also find really in-depth detailed descriptions on an internet community called Less Wrong and a blog called Overcoming Biases, which is where a lot of my thinking comes from. I put a link to the article where I made this presentation from so that you can see it in more detail if you're interested. Another great resource for this that I actually haven't listened to, but I've listened to about a decade of their podcasts, so I'm pretty sure I can vouch for it, is The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. They put out a book that will walk through a lot of the concepts we cover in this course from the lens of skeptics. I'm sure that their book does a phenomenal job at being a primer to get a condensed discussion from them. Or if you're a podcast person, I highly recommend listening to that, and you'll get these concepts in smaller doses along with your scientific news of the week. So we have this problem. And the answer is, if you build in techniques, strategies, and fail-safes, you can kind of help combat it. Also, something I don't talk about in detail here is if you have friends that will call you out on it. Remember, all this stuff is easier to see in other people. If you can calmly say, hey friend, I think you just fell prey to the anchoring bias. Maybe you should reevaluate that offer. And they can do the same for you, and no one will get offended. You'll be much better off in the long run. So one concept I want to talk about before we get into the strategies is a straw man versus a steel man. The former, the straw man, is a bit more familiar, as it is making its way into more common discussions. It's basically a mockery of your opponent's argument. Memes actually do a very good job of straw manning arguments. I love memes, as I'm sure you've noticed, and I do think that they're an easy way to quickly show a concept. However, they are often used and disseminated purposely to straw man the opposite side. You don't want to do this for a belief that you disagree with. You want to disagree with the absolute strongest argument that the concept can put forth. And notice I say the concept, not the person. My father once told me, just because you can win an argument doesn't make you right. It took me about a decade to fully understand how correct that comment was. To truly be correct, you need to not only beat out the argument of the person you are arguing with, but beat out every possible argument for that side that could ever be argued on the concept. Depending on the variety of factors, this might mean that you need to make your opponent's argument for them even. And this is called steel manning. This could be seen as playing devil's advocate, but here you want it to be wholehearted. Often when people use that phrase, they then go on to do it half-heartedly, and they often even straw man instead of steel man. A way to do this that I think is fun, though temperament and personality matters here, is to argue with people you agree with. There's no better ways to find flaws in your own arguments than to argue against them with every intention of, quote, winning. From there, later on, you can clean up those holes if they're simply oversights, or you can actually reevaluate your own opinion on the subject if it turns out that those holes aren't just holes in your understanding, but rather a reason to change your mind. Or perhaps just have a more nuanced understanding of where your mind sits as well. Remember though, the internet likes to make everything out to be binary, this or that. Most issues are a large spectrum of possibilities and thoughts. Doing this well actually requires a huge amount of work because you have to understand the opposite side. And doing that can be really, really hard and really painful depending on who you're trying to understand. There is no way to steel man the red pill Reddit user without spending time in their Reddit. There is no way to steel man a flat earther without listening to all of their arguments about why the earth is flat. Now we're going to walk through some specific ways of combating this. In each case, I'll describe the method, and then I'll have some internal dialogue to try to make it a little bit more reachable as to how it actually looks. So first off, you can't fix something that you don't even know is a problem. This is one of the major pieces in fixing motivated cognition, accepting that you do it. No matter how smart you are, you do it. Knowing that will help you spot it. Here's an example of how it can help. I like whiskey, fatty foods, and I also like working out. I learned about motivated cognition in class, so I need to be aware that when articles come out discussing whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise, that I'm going to be at risk for those faulty ways of thinking. Another way to do this is to give yourself some slack to make mistakes or be wrong or live a little. In our silly food example, we have this shift in internal dialogue. I like whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise. It does not matter if these are good or bad for me. I'm going to partake in them because enjoyment is a part of the human experience. I should still recognize these biases exist and consider them when reading information on it, but I don't have to be convinced that these are good for me in order to allow myself to do them. In situations where it really isn't okay to just, quote, indulge, this idea still plays a role. For instance, it's easier to respond to research on racial bias productively if you aren't particularly caught up in the feeling of, I'm not racist. If you're able to say, okay, so I'm not perfect, and I've made mistakes, and I'm incredibly likely to make more, but I can use this new information to help me be better. This is far more productive than beating yourself up over past sins, which can often cause the identity protection wall of, quote, I'm not racist, to show up and block improvement. Saying, quote, I'm not racist, is in nearly all cases for all people regardless of color or upbringing, a very comforting lie. So we want to avoid rewarding comforting lies and instead reward ourselves for uncomfortable truths, which we can then improve upon. This next one is in many ways similar to number 1 and helps you be able to institute number 2. We want to avoid moments where believing the opposite option feels bad. If I believe that some of my favorite foods are bad for me, then that will hurt me. If I notice that hurt, then I can adjust my beliefs on the research I read about it to account for that. So for instance, dialogue to avoid would be, I like whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise. I also like to be healthy. I want to have both, but I can't. I have to choose between the two. You would want to do something more like, I like whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise. When someone says that fatty foods are bad for me, I flinch and think, no, sugar is worse. I should recognize that flinch response makes me more likely to fall prey to motivated cognition. By saying it's okay to eat some fatty foods even if they might be bad for me, I can help minimize this. This can even be a very literal flinch. For instance, getting a shot or watching your baby cry for a shot, for instance. That hurts, physically or emotionally, respectively. And finding ways to be able to escape having to do that regularly and having it be, quote, good for our baby can be a really comforting prospect. To avoid a way of thinking that is very all or nothing. This doesn't so much mean getting to have it all, so much as accepting trade-offs. For example, back to our food example. I like whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise. I also want to be healthy, avoid heart disease, heart attacks, and strokes. Alcohol and fatty foods could raise these risk factors. I will accept that moderation may be needed in the alcohol and fatty foods to balance the risk to my health. However, I don't have to be perfect in my healthy choices to still be healthy. Regardless of the outcome of studies, I will work to balance my healthy and unhealthy choices, allowing me to analyze these studies better. Here, we ultimately are doing the things we know might have risks, but accepting those risks with an open mind and analyzing new data as it comes in to see when the risks may or may not change to a different level of acceptability. This is a pretty huge deal in the world of COVID-19 rationalizations. It seems the only two options are to barricade yourself inside and never talk to anyone, or party it up like it's 2019. But that's simply not true. You can make each risk decision individually and decide what is and isn't worth the risk. Perhaps you decide that going to a friend's birthday party with 20 people is really important and worth it to you. That doesn't mean that you also need to decide that, well, whatever, I'm going to get it anyways, and also go back to your normal routines of grocery storing and restauranting daily. We can choose to reconcile the fact that we may choose a risky behavior today, but not have to talk ourselves into believing that there is no risk in order to do so, or that taking that risk means that we have to be more risky in the future. And another way to help minimize motivated cognition is to refuse to take a particular stance to absolution. And this is similar to the last one. We can't ever know something with any absolute certainty, so instead of treating it as such, we build in room for uncertainty and odds playing into your mental maps of the situation. You may choose to try and put actual odds on it, or simply use language which implies particular odds. Continuing with our example. I like whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise. I know that whiskey and fatty foods have some health risks. I also see research saying that they might provide some benefit. Based on all of the evidence, it seems as if it is likely to have more risks than benefits, but moderation can be implemented. The exercise may likely offset some of the risky behavior with the food and alcohol intake. I will continue to monitor the situation and decide. Here I'm not saying things are or are not. I'm saying they are more or less likely. And that is an important way to minimize motivated cognition because things are a slight shift in your thinking as opposed to having to do a 180 on your thoughts. Now take a minute and think about a place in your life where this could come up. I'll give you an example of mine. Anti-fluoride studies are generally horrifically pseudoscientific nonsense. For whatever reason, this is another place that health nut groups, who again are near and dear to me, and I have many friends in such groups, have latched onto. So generally, when I see an anti-fluoride study, my eyes glaze over and I move on with my life. But while I was pregnant, one linking child IQ with maternal intake while pregnant came out. I only even paid attention to it because it came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is one of the most trusted sources. While it would have been tempting to stick with my mental models of all this research is always crap, I read it and I mentally tore it apart. Certainly acting in a motivated skepticism way, as it is very similar to the quality of those studies showing no link between fluoride and basically anything of importance. Though I still didn't truly believe the study, at the end of my research on it, I had to accept that my motivated cognition of anti-fluoride research's poor quality was probably affecting my ability to adequately judge. Rather than mentally think, this study is wrong, I changed it to, this study is likely going to be wrong, as it goes against all available evidence. However, as the risks to adjusting my life to this are low, I will do so and then continue to monitor the research as it updates. This way, I never really had to truly commit to believing or not believing the evidence, as getting a filter to filter the fluoride out cost very little, and there was no risk to it as long as I continued to properly care for my teeth. There was no reason not to. It allowed me to sort of think around my motivated cognition on a topic, even though I never truly was able to get rid of my biases on it. It also allowed for me to change my models as more research comes into light on the topic, without having to make any particular large shift in the way that I see myself, as I did or did not tie any part of this to my identity. Try to do something similar for your life. Not necessarily having to walk through it all at this moment, but think of a place where this motivated cognition could come into play. And then over the course of maybe a day or so, let it kind of ruminate in your mind and think about ways that you could avoid this. Going through the methods that I talked about with our whiskey, fatty foods, and exercise example, or the anti-fluoride example, which is basically the exact same set of protocols. Try to do this before meeting up with your group a little bit, and then share it with your group if possible, and kind of discuss each other's and see if you can help them out. Because again, it's always easier to see this in other people than yourself. And with that, we will be back next time.